people who do the legwork for the EU, actually operate the machinery of it, are socialists. They're believing international socialists. But they'd say the real hardcore left in the UK now have actually spotted that it's a con, because the inner core of the EU is fascist. It was meant as a combination of the two things. You have the fascists on the inside and the socialists on the outside, and they've actually twigged, which is really quite good. And they actually turned against it, and they were campaigning alongside us in the 2009 European elections, and they were as anti-EU as we were. Do you know that when they held the Bilderberg conference in Portugal a few years ago? No, I wasn't there. But there were some journalists went. Now you can confirm this for me. Yeah. My understanding is that there is a very, very strict law in Portugal against carrying guns. No one is allowed to carry guns. This is my understanding. But you're from Portugal, maybe you can tell me that whether this is the case. Because some years ago, when these guys were in Portugal and they were meeting, they had armed private security with like submachine guns outside the hotel. And my understanding is that that's completely illegal in Portugal. No matter how important you are, how much money you have, no one can carry guns in public. Now, you could probably tell me whether that's true or whether it's not. But
the security guard, if he has a permit.
He can with a permit?
Yeah, with a permit. Yeah. Only with that.
And these guys were foreigners who'd only been in the country for one day, so could they possibly have got permits?
That's a good question.
That's a good question, isn't it? Yeah, because the journalists who were there, they literally had machine guns pointed at them, and it's very, very scary stuff. I mean, much more serious than what we're seeing today. They're making it look very low key today.
So that was real.
That was real. That was in Portugal. I've seen the film.
Jim Tucker was shot at you was with him? No, you were with him?
No, I wasn't with him, but I've seen the footage from a guy from the UK. I can't remember his name now, but he was a journalist. He's done many things here.
Charlie Skelton.
No, Skelton was there, but it wasn't him. It was the guy who wrote the book called Them. He's done comedy and loads of other stuff. He's done, UK TV and things. Yeah. And he went along fairly unseriously.
Oh, right. John Ronson.
John Ronson, that's right. And I mean, he ended up being followed around by secret police, and he ended up being locked up.
Yeah.
And he's got some footage. A lot of it wasn't shown in the documentaries because it's pretty shaky and not high quality. But he's got some footage of some pretty scary-looking individuals. Black uniforms, body armor, machine guns. The full works. I mean, these guys are not joking about. And there was debate as to whether they were Mr. Kissinger's private security. Some people said they were, and other people said they were. Sorry, it's just another mic. So other people said they were the Bilderberg security. But we're clearly not seeing them here today.
No.
Which is an interesting change over the past few years.
Maybe unless they're hidden away.
Yeah, unless they're hidden away on a rooftop somewhere, pointing long rifles at us. Yeah. Anyway, you wanted to ask some questions.
Yeah, you were talking about the communist parties. They now are against the EU.
Yes, not the Communist Party, but the socialist workers, who are a bit like the communists here. They're the very hard left socialists, socialist revolutionaries, really, in the UK. They're small in number, but they've been around for a long time. And they have realised now that the EU is not the great international socialist that it was sold to them as. It's always been promoted to the left as being the realisation of their dream of an international socialist. And the real hard left has now realised that that's not true. If you go back in the documentation, in the history, the EU was designed by Jean Monnet as a synthesis of fascism and communism. It's communist on the outside, but it's fascist on the inside. The only group in the world who's allowed to propose laws to the EU is not a government or a council or anyone elected. It's something called the European Roundtable of Industrialists, some of the members of which are actually at Bilderberg today, the heads of BP and Shell and these huge corporations. There's about 14, I think, members of the ERT, as they call it, which is probably the French acronym for the European Roundtable of Industrialists. And they are the only body actually allowed to propose laws to the European Commission, which essentially means they go out, buy some lawyers who write the law. They give it to the European Commission, who edit it, translate it into 20-odd languages, and then pass it on to the European Parliament, who rubber stamp it, who pass it to the national parliaments, who don't read them. They don't read these laws that come from the EU. In a big pile at the beginning of the year, in September, they just pass them all through. So you effectively have the same corporate people who are here in Bilderberg writing their own law and using the European Union as a mechanism to get that law imposed without any democratic intervention at all.
So do you believe they're actually implementing policy in there?
They are deciding in policy, and they're absolutely they're deciding policy. But the most important thing that they're doing is they are persuading the politicians who are there to carry out policies that they've already decided on in the interests of the business people who are there. And that's why the academics are invited. The academics who are in there, who are the people that nobody, you read through the list of names and they're the ones you skip over because you've never heard of them. And they're, Dr. such and such from the University of Milwaukee or whatever it is. Nobody knows who he is. Why is he there? He's there because he's invited to present his ideas, because those are the ideas that the people in there with the money want the politicians to implement. So they invite the politicians along and they invite the academics along to persuade the politicians of a policy. We think it's a really good idea that you do this, and here's the academic argument as to why you should do it. Of course, the real reason for doing it is to benefit the same business people who are in there, who then, not in the UK, people forget this, that in most of the world academia is sponsored, but back in the US side, they sponsor the very same academics. So the money goes round. And the people who organise this conference want particular sets of ideas to be carried out. They bring the right business people, the right politicians who are going to have power next time, and the right academics to promote the ideas they want and to see them implemented. That's how it works.
That's why Farage is calling it tyranny.
Yes, The EU is the tyranny part of it. That's the part we kind of see. These guys are where the EU gets its ideas from, where they get their new laws from. They're going to make new laws. Well, what new laws are they going to make? They don't have any democratic process to decide what new laws they're going to make. They don't have anyone voting for them, so they can't say they don't care what's popular or what's not popular. Nobody votes for the EU. We vote people are members of the European Parliament, but they don't have any power. They're just a talking shop with a rubber stamp who go yes, no, and that's all they can say. Oh, we don't like this one, so we send it back, put it in a different binder, give it a different colour, give it a different name, edit some words, and send it back again. They don't change anything. They don't have any real authority. The authority is in the Commission.
Just going back to the policy. They're setting policy in there. Could you give us an example of policy that may have been set in the past at these meetings?
I can give you a very good example, and one that they've never officially admitted that they talked about. I can't remember whether it's 2005 or 2006, but you can go look this up. There was a leak. At the time, there was a lot of argument going on inside Bilderberg over the Iraq War and the Afghan War, which they actually fell out about. They actually disagreed about that, and the people who wanted those wars have largely been kicked out of real power now. You'll see that Blair's not here, Cheney's not here, Rumsfeld's not here, Feith is not here. These guys have been booted out because there was an argument, there was a disagreement. It's the first real genuine argument that they've had in many years, and those guys have lost the argument because the wars were a failure. Back in 2005, 2006, what were those guys discussing? They were discussing whether the oil price...
Zionism has no place on this planet!
Good. Those guys were discussing whether the oil price should be $100, $120 or $140 a barrel. At the time it was 67. Within a few months after they were having that discussion, it was 127. Now, you can look at that and you can say, but they were just predicting that it was going to be. Well, no, they weren't predicting it was going to be. They were discussing, what shall we set the floor at? Shall we let it go down below $100 a barrel again, or should we not? And they were claiming to have the power to do that in their internal discussions. And what does history tell you? History tells you that the oil price spiked after that. The economy collapsed as a result, and that's why one of the reasons why we're in the recession that we're in. It's one of the things that triggered it off, but people have forgotten about it now. These guys were discussing that months before it happened. Now, I've asked people in the oil speculation, in the oil business, who say, "Oh, that's completely impossible. No one has that much power. You just cannot have that much leverage in that market. It's too open, it's too free, it's too public, it's too much information." I've asked them, well, let's say that they actually do have that much power. How much power would that be? And these guys can't even estimate it. Even the government of China couldn't do it. Well, if you believe that these guys actually pulled that off, that gives you a measure of how much power they actually do wield. And that's not just power over politicians, that's power over money and markets and prices. That is seriously scary stuff. I can't prove that they pulled that off, but the evidence is that they were debating it, and then a couple of months later it happened. And if you want to know why they debate behind closed doors and why they debate in secret, if I had taken that leak and I had gambled the money I had in my bank on them being right and them having that power, I'd be a millionaire now. I'm not. I didn't, and I don't regret it, because that would be an insider dealing. But that tells you what's going on in there, because if they're talking about things that are going to happen in 2-3 months' time, that are going to massively change oil prices, are going to massively change markets, that are going to change governments, the people in there who are listening to that can take bets on that. They can gamble on that. And they don't want you and I knowing that they know, and they don't want you and I being able to take the same gamble that they can take, because it devalues their bet. The odds will change. So if you want to know why they want to keep this secret, why all the people who go want to keep it secret, even the ones who are just people who are invited to be told what to do, well, that gives you some idea why that might be.
Yeah, what they might be discussing now.
What they might be discussing today. My guess, and it's only a guess, is that one of the big things they're discussing is Turkey. Turkey is an insoluble problem that they've created for themselves. They have promised the Turks entry into the EU, okay, and the government of Turkey has been keeping its people under control to a certain extent with that promise for years and years and years and years. So they've promised them entry into the EU, but they can't give it to them. They can't deliver on that promise, because if they do deliver on that promise, 16 million people will leave Turkey. This is according to the surveys, within 2 or 3 years. Every social security network in the whole EU will be bankrupt within a year, including the Germans. No fault of the Turks, no fault of the Turkish people, but the number of people moving from Turkey, when they're free to do so, into the rest of the EU will bankrupt every social security system, every school system, every public organisation in the whole of Europe will basically be bust within a year. Because that flow of people is totally unmanageable. It's on a completely different scale from anything that's been seen, frankly, since the Mongols turned up in Eastern Europe. It's just never been done before. So from a practical point of view, they cannot let Turkey into the EU. But they also can't say that they aren't going to, because the moment they say we're never going to let you in, you have an Islamic revolution brewing in Turkey. And nobody needs to be told how dangerous that is. So Turkey's been quiet, and they've been fudging this issue, and they've not been talking about it, and they've not wanted to talk about it because there's no answer, there's no solution for years. Years and years and years. They've said, oh yes, we're going to let you into the EU, but we're not going to give you a date. Yes, we just want you to do this, and we just want you to do this, but we're not going to give you a date. And they've been fudging this issue, tossing it back and forth, avoiding it for years and years and years. Well, who knows whether it's mostly to do with the money for the rich people. The rich people, the people there who want to run European-wide businesses, who don't want to pay tariffs, who want to have a big market to play in, they want to be in. And they sponsor the political parties, they back the politicians go, oh yeah, it's a really good thing. And of course, they promise the people that it will raise their standard of living. So lots of people there, the ordinary members of the public, millions of them, they want it because they think it will raise their standard of living. It won't necessarily. It might, but the only way the EU does that is by investing huge amounts of money that it takes from the rest of Europe in taxpayers' money into each country that joins in turn to essentially bribe them, build loads of roads, build loads of things, raise the standard of living for a while to bribe them that it was a good thing to do. Go to Ireland. At one point, about 6 years ago, every man, woman and child in Ireland was getting £1,600 a year per head, man, woman and child. So that's like £3,000 for a family in tax rebate and in investment that was being paid for by the rest of the EU, mostly by UK taxpayers. And they did a lot of good with it, but it ballooned the economy, it caused massive inflation, if you think house prices went up here, it was a fraction of what they did in Ireland. They went up 2 or 3 times more in Ireland than they did here. It was chaotic because this vast amount of money that was being poured in to persuade the Irish people that the EU really was a good thing and to go along with it and to keep voting for the treaties and everything else. They almost didn't persuade them, despite that. They still had to vote in referendums twice and everything else. If they did the same with Turkey, because Turkey's 70 million people, not 3 million, 7 million, it's 70 million people and they're a lot poorer, to put that same level of infrastructure and development into Turkey, you're just talking an amount of money that can't even be imagined. The Americans couldn't afford it. There's no way that the EU could afford it, even in the good times. Now, it would bankrupt everybody. As I say, it's impossible. They can't do it. But if they open the door, if they let Turkey in, and they don't do it, then the Turks will just leave and go to Germany or France, where they can get that standard of living anyway. And then you break all the social security systems, all the school systems and everything, transport systems and everything in those countries. It's an insoluble problem. It's not, it's not something that can be made to work.
In the national boards and different boundaries, and if you actually think globally instead of saying incredibly broken, then we wouldn't have this
No,
problem.
that actually makes it worse, and I can explain why that would be.
Let's have a fact. Let's everything's being put into defence budgets.
Yeah.
Let's put that into global growth. Why don't we do those things and stop with your piddly little common nationalism and racism? Because you really are offensive.
Not a racist, and never have been, and people who call me that...
associate yourself with that.
No, I don't. People who call me that are following Kenneth Clark.
National.
No, absolutely not. I'm not a
What do
Little
you stand
Englander.
for then?
I'm a large Great Britainer.
Why Great Britain? Why do your feelings stop for humanity at the borders?
My feelings for humanity don't stop, but
why are they so more enamoured of the British?
What
have the British done that you have to be so independent? What is so...
Let him have his interview.
My authority doesn't extend to those people. I'd love the French to be French and the Germans to be Germans and the Turks to be Turks. I don't want them to be British. As they want to. I want them to be free to be themselves in their own country with their own culture, doing things their own way. And that's, that whole thing is being massively disrupted. But yeah, the Turkish problem is one of the things I think they're thinking about, and they now have, and they're talking about in there, and they now have no choice but to talk about it because things are kicking off big time in Turkey. The politicians have made mistakes, the people are fed up, and the middle class there are probably more woken up than the middle class here. They've got a fairly good idea of what's going on. They probably watch Alex Jones. They have a fairly good clue about what's happening, and they're not happy about it. They don't want to be part of that mess. They don't want to be part of. Nobody there wants for Europe to turn around in 5 years' time and say, it was all going so well until we let the Turks in and they destroyed it all and blame them for it. They don't want that, and it's not their fault. If you were living there and you were poor and you couldn't get a job paying more than $100 a week because there are no jobs paying more than $100 a week, and you're free to move to Italy anytime you liked, of course you'd move to Italy. It only makes perfect sense for you to do so. The problem is that you and 15.99 million other people would do it, and then what would that do to Italy? It would be destroyed, not because of anybody's fault, but just because of physics, just because of space, just because of numbers. It's not an individual thing and it's not a racial thing. It's just a matter of what they call dynamic systems theory. Every economy, every infrastructure, every city is a dynamic system. And in any dynamic system, if you push it hard enough, if you inject enough energy into it, enough people into it, if you like, in one go, you will break it. It will crash. Guaranteed. Every time. Every dynamic system you can think of, from an ecosystem to an economy to an individual tree, if you put enough change into that system quickly enough, you'll destroy it. It'll die. It'll crash. Because it cannot adapt. It cannot cope. And this is why thinking globally, or having a single global economy, doesn't work. It's a total disaster. It's like having a single-celled organism. Okay, if those of you who know anything about evolutionary theory, the most complex, largest single-celled organism that I'm not a biologist, but that I've ever heard of is an amoeba. Right? The single-cell idea runs out at the point of an amoeba. Amoeba's just about big enough you can see it without a microscope, barely, if you've got really good eyesight. Okay, and it's a pretty low-level organism. That's it. That's where single-cell runs out, because single-cell, as an idea, having one single cell, means that you have to replicate incredibly quickly, you have to be incredibly simple, you have to be able to get energy from just about anywhere, and there has to be a very, very large number of you, or you don't survive. If you want to put it in evolutionary terms, it's an evolutionary dead end. Single-celled organisms didn't take over the world. Multi-celled organisms did. And what the globalists are doing is making the world economy into a single machine, into a single-celled organism, because it makes the pond they can play in and the amount of money they can make, the scale at which they can run their businesses, the amount they can own, bigger. Not because it works better, but because it makes them wealthier, because it makes them more powerful, because it means puts more people under their thumb and there's less people who can do what they want without their interference. But it's a total disaster, because what they're doing is they're going from a multi-celled system where the economy of France crashes. That's really bad for the French, but it's really good for the Germans because it makes French wine really cheap. So the Germans can all buy French wine really cheap, and then if the French economy were to absolutely tank, the Germans could help them out. They've just made they're just making a killing now because they can get all their wine and their cheese really cheap. So they're now doing really well. They can help the French out from being their next door neighbours, or we could. But if you only have one economy and it tanks, who's left to help you out? Who's left on the outside? If you only have a single-celled organism, you break the DNA in that cell, you poison that cell, that's it. Organism's finished. You do that in a human body, doesn't even notice, doesn't care. It's got 1 trillion cells. It can do without a few.
There's no redundancy.
There's absolutely no redundancy. And this is what's happening. I mean, I came up with a theoretical scenario a few years ago, which is not too far from what could actually happen. Let's say you have a critical microchip in an airline, right? So every airliner has one of these microchips. They have to have them, some sort of safety system. And then someone finds a fault in them. Okay, someone finds a fault. It's not a serious fault, but it means they've got to ground all the airliners. So every airliner's got to have the chip changed. Oh, but they only make the chip in one factory in Taiwan. Oh, we've just had a typhoon in Taiwan and the factory's been blown down. Well, they can rebuild the factory, but they need some kit from the US to do it, because that's the only place they make the kit. But they can't fly it in because they haven't got a plane, because the plane's grounded. Now, it's a theoretical scenario, but it's perfectly valid, you can imagine that actually happening, all right, they send it on a boat. But that means the whole world's economy is totally trashed and nothing works and you can't fly anything anywhere and everything stops for 6 months while they ship some piece of kit from the US to Taiwan to get everything going again. Why does that happen? It happens because things are only done in one place. Now, a lot of these guys in there will like to talk about economic efficiency. And they'll say, oh, we'll have globalization because it creates economic efficiency. Well, what does economic efficiency get you? What economic efficiency gets you is the most efficient factory for making that microchip stays in business and makes a fortune. The rest of them will go out of business because they're not efficient enough. So you end up with precisely one guy who makes that thing. Now, he's the best at it. And that, economically, from an economist's point of view, is the best outcome. Because he makes it best, he makes it cheapest, he makes the money from doing it, let him do it. But from a slightly different point of view, from a more human point of view, if there's only one guy doing it, and he keels over, if there's only one factory doing it and it blows down, disaster. There's no robustness. What you're doing is you're exchanging a robust system, a multi-celled system, a system that can sustain itself, that can survive crises, attacks, tsunamis, disasters, for a system that's incredibly efficient, that makes the people involved unbelievably wealthy, but which can't survive anything. You can tip it over with a feather. The slightest thing goes wrong. You've got thousands of what they call single points of failure all over the system. Now, anyone who's involved in computer design or any software like I am knows that the thing you want to avoid more than anything else is if you've got a critical system, any single point of failure is a disaster waiting to happen. But what these guys are doing with their foolish greed is they're creating single points of failure all over the global economic system. And sooner or later, one of those single points of failure is going to fail. And, you know, the current financial crisis that we have is going to pale into insignificance to the kind of, you know, to the situation where you can't get a pair of shoes. Now, and if you want an example of this, you want a model of this and what badly goes wrong, because it's only existed in microcosm, you know, then these microcosms are gradually being mopped up by the global system. In Zimbabwe years ago, where they were a totally isolated economy, they weren't allowed to trade, and they've got sanctions against them, they're being run by a madman who doesn't care about his people. There were crazy things that you just couldn't get. You couldn't get batteries. You know, they were just unobtainable. So anything that required a battery was immediately failed. These cameras, you couldn't do it. You couldn't run this, you couldn't run a press conference because you couldn't get a battery. You literally couldn't get a battery in the country, and if somebody had one, you could exchange it for gold. Because, you know, somebody really, really needed a battery to keep their heart monitor running, they'd pay in gold for it. You know, they would pay any amount of money to get hold of a battery. How stupid is that? Battery's not difficult to make. Battery's not expensive. It's not even that slightly resource expensive. But batteries in the rest of the world, we don't even think about it. They're cheap. Why couldn't they get batteries in that economy? Because nobody made them and nobody imported them. Because it was a centrally planned, single economy that had one crazy person's mind running the whole thing. And if he hadn't thought that maybe we need some batteries and organised getting them, they didn't arrive. They didn't turn up. They couldn't be made. They couldn't be imported. There were sanctions. There were difficulties. And it didn't happen. Now, what these guys are creating on a global scale is this kind of madman's paradise where they think they are so clever, that they are so advanced, that they are so incredibly knowledgeable, that they can run the whole world economy, that they can manage all these markets, that they can put in place all the rules that they want and all the laws that they want, and run everything on a global scale. As the man who was here just now, think on a global scale. Well, have you ever tried managing a hospital? Have you ever tried managing 1,000 people? Have you ever tried managing a small town? And these guys think they can run the world, you know, and a handful of people? It's crazy. It's madman stuff. It is absolute lunacy. 150 years ago, they would have been laughed at and locked up. And there were people like that, and they were laughed at and locked up because you can't do it. And the sheer arrogance and lunacy of these people. I mean, they call us lunatics for being out here and saying that they're conspiring. But the real lunacy here, the real madness, is to think that you can run the world economy as a single system and that you can manage that and not have total crash and total disaster. Anyone who really thinks that either hasn't looked into it, has no idea how systems work, or is just so arrogant that there's no you know, there really is no talking to. And unfortunately, some of the people in the Bilderberg conference are that arrogant, because I happen to have met one or two of them. Even stood for Parliament against one of them. And believe me, the level of their arrogance, it's hard to even comprehend it until you've actually seen it up close. Anyway.
What's your opinion on
My opinion on? Oh, sorry, I'm not hearing that. I'm going to come closer.
Barroso.
Oh, Barroso. Ah, yes, the president of Europe, the emperor of the non-imperial empire. I wouldn't want him within 100 yards of me. As far as I'm concerned, he's a traitor to his country. He is a scumbag of the highest order, and I don't want to have anything to do with him. I don't want to insult the Portuguese because I don't believe he is any longer Portuguese, and he no longer believes he is any longer Portuguese either. When Nigel Farage sat next to him at the front of the European Parliament and had a Union Jack on his desk, Nigel had a Union Jack on his desk about 4 inches high, and Barroso complained that he had a national flag on his desk. Nigel said to him, pointing at the 20-foot square, massive EU flag hanging on the wall, but the flag of your country's up there. And Barroso agreed with him. So anyone left in Portugal who believes that Mr. Barroso thinks he's Portuguese or is doing anything on behalf of Portugal, I'm afraid you're sadly mistaken.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.